Hi, this is Professor M, and I'm going to be talking about reading strategies, how to do it, reading, academic reading, annotating, writing questions, underlining words, writing in the margins. Okay, and I'm going to be going over about 4 different books, mainly this one to start. Okay, so let's go to chapter 10. We're going to start with that. And there's a whole list of topics there: annotating, taking inventory, outlining, paraphrasing, summarizing. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I am trying to convince you of the importance of reading. And of course, something in our culture where we have kind of lost our way. So we need to get back to reading. And I'm going to talk about a book or books I've read over break, and we'll also be going through Strange Pilgrims, and of course the Red textbook too. Okay, so it gives an example in chapter 10 of the Red book, Letter from Birmingham Jail by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You should know that, and you can see all the annotations in here. And also remember, don't fall into the trap that the writer is trying to set for you, which is to accept that point of view. So you might think about the historical context a little bit. When was it written? What was it about? Who are these different people in here? It mentions Martin Luther in addition to, obviously, the writer, Martin Luther King Jr. And it also mentions John Bunyan, must have been brother of Paul Bunyan. I know Paul Bunyan and the Blue Ox, but I don't know John Bunyan. So you have to think Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson. So all of these names are being dropped in Dr. King's essay. Okay? So you need to write in the margins. You can see what the editors of the textbook actually did. I'll show you better examples with my own pen. Continuing on, outlining. Okay, it's kind of boring, but you've probably had to do an outline where you have you ever had to outline a chapter, say from a history book in high school? That's difficult, pretty boring too. So you want to keep it pretty brief. You want to make it useful. You want to use your time. And you don't want to get bogged down in the reading. So maybe you don't want to read the whole chapter. Maybe you want to skim it and make a brief outline. I'm not big on outlines. I like notes, annotations. I try to put the argument in simple points. Okay. So remember, you're focusing on what are the arguments, what are they trying to say, what are the arguments in the different essays you're going to have to read in this book, like on selling body parts. Are you for that, against that? Are you convinced by it? Working at McDonald's, is that a good idea, bad idea, etc. Okay? So summarizing, can you summarize what you've read after you read a chapter or an essay? Can you summarize it? So there's examples of that. You just want to pick out the main points. You don't want to over summarize. You want to make sure you get the main points and then some less important points down below. Synthesizing. Do you want to compare it to Gandhi's essays or Thoreau's essays, Walden, that kind of stuff, as opposed to Martin Luther King Jr.? Contextualizing, that's kind of similar as well. What's the context? What was Martin Luther King Jr. up to? We think nonviolent protest. What else is there in the record about that? Of course, you had an FBI file by Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover. So you want to contextualize it. His children, his wife, his church, where was he from? Also, In Dr. King's work, of course, you're going to find figurative language, metaphors, similes, symbolism. So you want to look at that carefully and see, does it work? Does it really mean anything? The stumbling block in his stride toward freedom. What's a stumbling block? Okay. Like a boil that can never be cured. Ew, that sounds really terrible. A boil that might continue to grow. Okay. So you need to pay attention to figurative language as well, and that's a little more tricky whether it works. Patterns of opposition. Patterns are usually like compare and contrast, definition. Is he trying to define freedom? Is he trying to define peaceful protest, progress? What is he trying to define in there? So you got to keep track of the different patterns. Could be illustration. Is he trying to illustrate a point, almost like a drawing? So there are many different ways you can do that. Then finally, you can reflect on challenges to your beliefs. Do you believe in equality for all people? Do you think some people shouldn't have equal rights? I mean, we do need a more equal society, but has the essay, has what you just read challenged your ideas on your own opinions, values, beliefs on a subject, okay? Okay, then we also have evaluating the logic of an argument. What I said earlier, pay attention to what the author is trying to convince you of. What is the argument? And of course, an easy way to do that is to try to use the old way that Socrates would do it, which is put, depending on if it's an inductive or deductive argument, then you want to put, P implies Q, P, therefore Q. So that's called symbolic logic. And what that could mean is, all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, inductive arguments are a little more tricky, and we'll talk about those later, where you're just coming up with a bunch of examples, and then you're making a broad conclusion based on that. Toyotas are reliable, Hondas are reliable, Ford's reliable, Chevy's reliable, GMC's reliable, BMW's reliable. What's the conclusion? Well, all those cars are reliable. So that's an inductive argument. Okay, let's continue. So you want to pay attention. What are the arguments? Are you getting the whole argument, the beginning, middle, end, conclusion of the argument? And then there's some tests in here too. Test for appropriateness on page 348. How does each reason or piece of support relate to the thesis? So we're going to talk about that when we get to writing. That's the next section, next lecture. Test for believability. There's the old courtroom test for attorneys, and in law school they say, can it pass the laugh test? So is what the writer, the attorney or person arguing in court, also, can it pass the laugh test? Okay? So facts, examples, anecdotes, you want to make sure that those are appropriate and are relevant to the situation. So you want to make sure, like a lot of people now are saying, America's in decline, just like the Roman Empire back in the day. And just like the Roman Empire? I mean, you really can compare our society, like post-capitalistic, quasi-democratic society, to Roman society. A huge empire, which was probably bigger than the U.S. So I'm not sure you can just make any old comparisons. You cannot. You have to be careful. Statistics, be careful. Remember the old saying of Dr. and Father Meehan, you can prove anything with statistics, and he had a PhD from Berkeley, so I think he knew what he was talking about. So be careful when people are using statistics. There are lots of tricks. Remember the old Crest commercial? 3 out of 4 dentists surveyed believe in Crest. Well, that's 3 out of 4 that you surveyed. You could pick the ones that you knew were sympathetic towards Crest. So you got to be careful with statistics. Authorities, same thing. Is Michael Jordan an authority on Hanes underwear? Is Charlie Sheen an authority on anything? Maybe. So you got to keep track of who are the experts. Bill Gates, is he an expert on vaccines? Maybe he's an expert on computer programming, building a business, in computer tech stuff. But is he really an expert on vaccines? I don't think he's there yet. Now, that doesn't mean that he's trying to inject us and force us to take a vaccine. He's going to put, tracking materials in the vaccine so he can keep track of us. I don't think he's into that either. But I don't think he's an expert on vaccines or contagious diseases. So I have a hard time listening to him on the news. Okay. So also recognizing emotional manipulation. So don't be manipulated by the emotional. We see this in commercials. You'll see it in this textbook as well. So you want to be careful not to be manipulated by pathos. Pathos, the Greek word for pathetic, sympathy, sad. Judging the writer's credibility, so that's a better word for ethos and character. So you need to keep track of that. And test for common ground. Did the writer try to give any common ground, like Dr. King? Which I think he did. I mean, referring to our children. Well, we all have children. Well, no, we don't all have children. But when he said that, the content of their character, I think that's something we can all agree is common ground. Test for fairness. So you want to make sure the author's credible, tone of the argument, make sure they're not sarcastic, shrill, condescending, bullying especially. So I really don't like bullying. Okay, so that's all we have from the book for now. So that was mainly chapter 10. Now, let me give you a couple brief examples. Here is the book you're supposed to be reading soon anyway, and you'll read the prologue as well. Look at the notes that I made. I even gave the story another. So this is annotation. I gave the title another name. I put Strange Pilgrims, and then it says, I put The Art of Detail and Digression. All right, so I made some notes here. I circled pilgrim, why pilgrim? And then I put, this has been a strange creative experience and should be explained. I put there, give examples. And so I make notes. I underline in red or green. So he also says, so he's talking about writing short stories, how difficult that is. And the fact that he says in a short story you have to establish everything in the very first paragraph. You have to define everything: structure, tone, style, rhythm, length, and sometimes even the personality of a character. Okay? So he goes into a lot of what his beliefs are. And then over here I put, when he's talking about, so he lived in Europe, and then he talks about going back to Europe, probably by himself, taking a trip and revisiting places where he had lived: Barcelona, Geneva, Rome, Paris. So I put European vacation there. So writing process, stories have lives of their own, not the most exciting things, but that's just a prologue to give you an idea of what you should do. And preferably look at the old green pen. Do that is good. And if you have the ebook, I guess, well, try to print it out. Unimportant pages. Then I'm briefly going to talk about reading Aristotle's Politics over break. And yes, I read the whole thing. And it's kind of dense, as you can see. And I made notes. I ask questions. I don't even let Aristotle off the hook. You shouldn't let anybody off the hook, even your own teacher. Even the priest, the minister, spouse, children especially, don't let them off the hook. Boyfriend, girlfriend, ooh, never. Okay, so there's a lot of application to what I'm talking about here, but you need to annotate, take notes, write in the margins. Now look, since this is the Great Books collection, I write in pencil. So I also have a pencil somewhere. And one more. Oh yes, here's the one. When I got tenure, somebody put this in my box, so I still have it attached to the lead because, you know me, I'd lose it. So I used this to write in these kind of books that are precious. So you're not going to be able to see much, but I do. And, you know, these are basically Aristotle's lecture on politics and riots, revolution, assassination. He defines the parts of the soul in here, believe it or not. He talks about usury. So he's all over the place. He considers what form of political community is best. He does a lot of contrast with Plato. So remember Aristotle, Plato. And mentions Socrates, Heraclitus, of course. So there is just a ton, and he's all over the place. But I did get through this. It's the first time in my life, 8 books of the politics, and contrast with Sparta, okay, Crete, Carthage. So there's all kinds of things you're going to have to make reference to. You got to know a little bit of history. And he goes into how long people should serve as leaders, and he says 6 months should be the limit, not 6 years like our senators, 6 months. So he's got a lot of ideas, and he speaks on them, and he's all over the place as far as humans. He gets into abortion. Couples should not have too many kids, and then they should decide after that whether to abort. And then he also says, where does life begin, though? So in that same section. So it's just very thorough, but it's also kind of disjointed in that he talks about polity being the best form of government. And I know this is not your political science class. His naturalism, that the state, the country is kind of like the parts of an animal or the animal kingdom. He talks about the middle class, believe it or not, and of course we're in big trouble because he says the middle class needs to be the dominant party in politics, and of course we don't really have a middle class anymore in America. Okay, so you get the idea. Notes everywhere, and of course he changes topics a lot, and I'm trying to think. He even gets into virtue, happiness, fortune. He talks about that too, that happiness is really only possible for those who have good fortune, that, you know, they're not like Job where their wife takes off on them, where their children all die, although it would be you lose all your income. That's misfortune. So adultery, he talks about that. He's got some pretty serious offenses for people that commit adultery. He talks about education being the most important factor in a politician's life, and the Constitution, teaching young people to obey the Constitution. So maybe that's what I was looking for, given the fact that a number of the last even presidents of our country have trampled on the Constitution, called it a piece of paper, and that's really sad. Okay, so that's going to conclude this lecture on mainly reading. You have to remember, you have to read. You need to be good at it. You don't need to read every word, except if it's, I was going to pick up the book. Fiction, you should read every word if possible, unless it's like David Copperfield. I mean, that's like 800 pages. But if we're talking about a text, our textbook, you're probably going to skip a little bit. Okay, so that concludes this lecture, and see you soon. Bye.